Three, two. Hello, today I am debating the pro side of compared to conservatives, liberals hold the moral high ground. First, I'd like to frame this debate in what it is and what it isn't. What it is and political principles, not exactly physical ones. We can debate on that later if you want. What the resolution is not is first saying conservatives as individuals are immoral, or that liberals as individuals should consider themselves superior to them. That's not what I'm debating at all. I just want to make that very clear. I'm making a moral comparison between the two ideals and principles of the left and the liberals versus the ideals of the right and the conservatives. This debate is mostly about principles, comparing the two as they stand today currently. I think the core principles and philosophy of who we are determines the resolution of what those principles occupy the moral high ground, and I believe that to be liberals. Principles that I want to get into definition of what I consider liberal and what I consider conservative, because this has changed throughout history. So my definition would be liberals are more about individual ideology. They're open to experience. Their moral structure is more grounded in individual empathy than pack mentality or blind loyalty. Conservatives, I view them, they're more keeping to tradition, have traditional values that have passed down through their family values, and are more cautious or frightened of change and innovation. But one of their better traits is they have better loyalty to people they consider to be on their team or group. And sometimes I would debate almost to a fault. Since liberals by definition are open to experience, that means we are open to experience of how conservatives think and feel. I believe listening, empathy, trying to work together are high moral traits. And I see these principles on the liberal side, but unfortunately, not so much on the conservative side. I consider empathy to be the bedrock of all morality. You can see this predominantly in liberal principles and what they fight for, be it civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, transgender rights. It's mostly empathy towards the individual who seems to be downcast or doesn't have an ally with the general public. That's where I think the greatest trait is that liberals share that perhaps conservatives can do better on. The conservatives, however, seem to have empathy for people with money, rich people paying taxes, which can confuse a lot of liberals, including myself, because, oh no, rich people, their life is so hard. It seems.
Okay, so before we really get into my response, I think I get where you're going. I want to ask just a couple of questions to kind of understand fully what you're saying. My questions really to understand your case are: where does morality come from? Who defines it? And can you list off a list of things that are morally good and morally bad?
Absolutely. Morality is, I would say, comes from both nurture and nature. Some of it we are born with, it comes through our biology, and the other bit we sort of learn it over time. And I would break morality into what we consider to be justice, what we consider to be fair, and empathy and harm and well-being and security of everyone else around us, as well as the other things I mentioned. Some people would consider purity to be part of morality. This is basically keeping yourself more intact than others around you. But that's also debatable as well. I think liberals don't do so well on purity unless you were talking about veganism or, well, even perhaps recycling and keeping the planet pure. I guess that would be a trait of moral purity as well. I would pass the mic and say, what would you consider conservative morality comes from?
Right. I think my opponent presented a very interesting point, and that's exactly why I disagree with the resolution. He presented this idea that we learn morality, one, that it comes from nature, and some of it comes from nature and some of it comes from how we've learned over time. Now, first off, I'd like to point out that multiple different societies will learn at different rates. For example, that's why some societies who live in South America are cannibalistic, and we might think that that's really, really bad, but that's their view because they have a different sense of morality. Let's talk about my opponent's nature point. What is a law of nature? Now, if you're an evolutionist or an atheist or whatever, you usually believe that the law of nature is inherently survival of the fittest. We see this throughout all of nature. The important thing to note is that when we look at other animals, no animals go out of their way to help other animals outside of like their pack or their direct neutral family. Now, the important thing to note here is because a survival of the fittest mentality has no room for empathy. If we're talking about morality coming from nature, then empathy is not the bedrock of morality. Protecting and promoting yourself definitely is. The other point really I want to make here is that morality is relative. Since we don't really know where morality comes from and where part of it comes from different cultures and how they learn, different cultures will have different views of morality, especially the culture of conservatism and the culture of liberalism. Let's take a look at something like abortion, where the majority of liberals, I think we can agree, are for it, and the majority of conservatives, we can say, are against it. The conservatives' viewpoint, from their viewpoint, the liberals are murdering children. And that sounds terrible. And from the liberal viewpoint, the conservatives are taking away people's freedom. Both of those sound like equally terrible things. But the problem is they both come from different views of morality and different points. My point is, because there's no way we can establish why his view of morality is the best view of morality, how in the world are we ever supposed to say that this resolution is true? Because from the liberal standpoint, yes, they hold the moral high ground. And from the conservative standpoint, they hold the moral high ground. And there's no way to tell which is inherently more beneficial. Even the idea of empathy is not strictly true. Let's talk about the empathy that liberals possess. The common exhibition of this is through the welfare state. We can see like famous African-American economists like Thomas Sowell talk about how the welfare state is inherently detrimental, because what it does is it sets up people to fail. You see the famous saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for the rest of the days of his life. The problem with the welfare state is what it does is it makes it more profitable for people to be given a fish than for them to actually learn to better themselves. That's not really empathy. That's just stealing from another person to give to another person. You're not teaching those people to be better. I can make more money as an unemployed person than working hard. I can make a decent living off of government welfare. That's not actual empathy. That isn't actually trying to help me. If anything, that hurts me more than it helps me. And that's why I believe that there's really no way to determine who is morally better.
All right. Well, you went over some things I thought were just wrong. Are you saying, just need to pass the question of your first point, that symbiotic relationships just don't exist in nature? Are you denying that they exist in nature?
I'm saying, as far as I'm aware, I can't really think of any animal that outside of like its pack or its direct family really like helps. Like you don't see wolves go and get food and give it to an entirely different species of animal or a different wolf pack. No, normally they stick within their groups. Empathy isn't really something like going out of our way, like we see I think both liberals and conservatives do to a certain extent, go out of the way, like helping refugees. That's not something that's necessarily seen in nature. If we want to talk about morality coming from nature, we don't see that in nature. So I don't really know how that's a defendable position.
Well, I don't know what to say other than you would be wrong. We see it all the time in nature. Different species have symbiotic relationships all over the place. The first one that comes to mind is the shark and the little feeder fish that eats all the bacteria, offers it protection. And that's just one example. I'm sure there are many, many more. If I knew that was going to be an issue of the debate, I could have researched and come up with more. But we do see it in nature and in baboon culture too. We see, I think that's where our morals actually come from. They come from our ability to cooperate. We've evolved them because we need them to cooperate. And that's sort of cooperation is what defines our morals. And that's sort of why we aren't killing each other, or we are killing each other. We have this innate ability in our brain that wants to form us into teams. We're doing it right now. Right now, a lot of even the viewers might be on the liberal team, they might be on the conservative team. That's something so ingrained in us, it's very hard to actually change anyone's mind on it. But we need to realize that as conservatives and liberals, we actually kind of need each other. We need to cooperate. And that's where morality comes from. You don't really see, conservatives reaching out to the other hand of the liberals. They've already, blackened the liberals off as immoral, whatever, nothing good can come from them. But it's actually through this understanding of each other and our cooperation where our morals are derived from. And I think if one side is just not willing to see the other side because of whatever innate moral reason they, were taught or grew up with, well, that's a shame. And I think it's also a little bit immoral to not be open up to that experience. And liberals are the ones that are open to experience, who want to understand conservatives. And I think the problem with conservatives and why they don't have the moral high ground is because they're closed off individuals who think they already know what's right, who think in their minds, just as pretty much everyone does here, that they are right. And I think I see more often liberals, including myself, totally open to the idea of, hey, I might be wrong. And that's why, as I will be more pro towards the
All right, and I definitely agree with you. I think there's a very polarizing right now in America where nobody wants to talk to each other. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily just conservatives who don't want to talk to liberals. I think we can point, as you said, we're not really trying to talk about people. We're trying to talk about the ideologies. And I agree to it a certain extent. Yes, conservatives inherently believe more of looking like to the past to kind of like see how they choose to move forward in the future. They like to look at the past, like to see past precedent, our past traditions, like to hold on to that. And I agree to that. Progressives, though, inherently, or what you're talking about liberals, and you're kind of saying that liberals and progressives are kind of the same thing. And I get what you're saying about they're open-minded. What the fallacy that you're creating here, though, is that conservatives aren't necessarily not open-minded. They just, when they think about subjects, they think about it in context of what they've experienced before. We can see this, like the famous philosopher Edmund once said, that those who do not look to history are doomed to repeat it. Whenever we see societies that don't really look at what has happened in the past, they see severe failures. Like when we see that through communist societies now that try and produce this system that doesn't really work economically, we see consistent failures. So conservatism, in a way, is trying to be cautious. It's trying to actually take care of its people. Okay. As to your point about the point about the shark and the feeder fish, empathy is having the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand how they're thinking. The feeder fish of the shark doesn't really care about the shark's bacteria. It wants to survive. And so if it eats the shark's bacteria, it's surviving itself. It's trying to survive itself. That's the whole thing of nature, is everybody wants to survive, and usually the fittest and the most profound survive. That's not, the fish isn't doing it because he feels sorry for the shark. That's what empathy is. We do things because we're like, they're in a terrible place. Okay. That's why we do things. That's what empathy is. Nature doesn't, we don't see that in nature. So to say that nature is the basis of morality, which is one of your ways of looking at the basis of morality, just simply isn't true. Okay. We can talk about all day long on where morality comes from, but ultimately, unless you believe in some sort of God or deity, morality is just subjective. As I pointed out, there are cultures that believe cannibalism is okay. That doesn't make it that, and the idea of progressivism is being open-minded would say, yes, they're just as right as we are. We just have a different viewpoint than them. That's the problem. A progressive mindset inherently in and of itself agrees. And an atheist or progressive mindset will agree that morality is relative. There's no way to say this resolution is true, because from that perspective, there can't be an absolute right or wrong.
I would say you're incorrect. Empathy will tell you if cannibalism is wrong, because any normal functioning human being who hasn't, for some reason been brainwashed that if they commit cannibalism, they'll gain eternal life, will empathize with the person being eaten. So it's not so much of, oh, we need to respect every single idea. In fact, I think you'll find liberals highly don't. Whenever there's an idea that we're out there protesting, we're out there making our voices heard and being squarely in the face as if, we're, referees or critiques, that this is morally wrong. And I don't think you really need all that much to understand that cannibalism is wrong. You don't need a God to tell you cannibalism is wrong. We inherently know that because we're a cooperative species. We're a cooperative species because in order for us all to thrive, we have to understand the commonality that human flourishing is a good thing. And since we all understand human flourishing is a good thing, we go about how to best have human flourishing. And I'll end with a question. would you consider happiness and the country's happiness to be of, if they are happier, would you consider them to be more successful or more in a high moral standard than to those that are not happy?
No, I don't really think that happiness is a way to decide if something has a morally upright nation. As to your point, I also want to ask you a question. Do you eat meat?
Yes, I eat meat. And I'm glad you brought up that point. There are plenty of vegan liberals. There are plenty of vegan conservatives. Um, I would consider putting empathy into animals is almost like an empathy misfire. And I would relate it to the same as the abortion topic. And, conservatives might empathize for the fetus because they say that is me. I think vegans do the same with animals. They say that is like me, that has feelings like me, that has capacities like me. I should empathize it like it is me. But I think when you understand animals and when you understand biology and fetuses and the medical practices, you begin to have a better understanding that it's different, it's not like you. And even so, many things in nature eat meat, many things in nature behave this way. Consuming meat substance, I don't consider to be immoral, but that's on a personal level, but that's an entirely different debate.
It's not really the purpose of this debate. I'm just simply pointing out that if we talk about empathy with another person, saying that inherently humans are social creatures, and I would agree to that to a certain extent, but to say that if we hold empathy, therefore we're more highly morally valuable, would be to say that vegans are more morally valuable than other people because they hold empathy with the things they eat. See, the problem with the view of morality as nature is nature doesn't discriminate. Nature doesn't see a difference between me or a penguin, right? So in a sense, the views of nature, the views of survival of the fittest should apply to everyone. It doesn't really matter who you're eating. The whole idea that empathy exists within nature is not strictly true, unless you're saying that humans are outside of nature. Outside of nature, then we obviously have to have an outset of a different view of morality. And the problem that you haven't shown throughout this debate is why your view of morality, that empathy, is the view of morality that everybody should hold to decide if this resolution is true or false. To prove if this resolution is true, you must show that there is an objective form of morality that is your morality. As I brought up examples, we can look at it throughout history, but conservatism inherently tries to equip people to better protect themselves. If anything, it's more empathetic. Even in your view of morality, conservatism and leading to things like free trade or leading to things like limited government or trying to promote less of like a big brother of people telling you what you can and cannot do upholds more of the laws of nature. The laws of nature didn't dictate that people should band together and create rules for each other. That's not natural. We don't really see that in other species. So to say that somehow viewing the world from a liberal perspective is more morally valuable than any other perspective is just wrong. Okay. Again, pointing back to the abortion example, there's no way to say that somehow one view of morality is better than the other because both of them try and seek empathy. They just seek it in different ways. If we're assuming that empathy is the basis of morality, both of them try to fix problems. They just look at them from different perspectives. We see this all around the world. We see this through every single society. That's the problem, is that if there is no true objective way to measure what is the best morality, you can't say that liberals are somehow more, or the liberal ideology is more morally valuable than conservatism.
I would say so because of current conservatism, what they value basically greed and selfishness, my and my alone. They look at outsiders as outsiders. I think liberals have kind of come to this understanding that we as a human race, it's all human flourishing. So we empathize with us more on a global scale, and also how does a nation fit into that? So when you look at conservative values, you see, protection for oneself, pro gun. You see, border walls, pro defense of the country. You kind of look outside and you see sort of like this afraid of the unknown. And I think liberals actually embrace the unknown. They want to discover the unknown. And it's sort of through their understanding of the unknown that they have championed all these movements. They have championed women's rights. They have championed the civil rights era. They have championed transgender rights, gay marriage. I'll go down the list and list women's. I think I already covered women's rights. I think it's because liberals understand that these rights are important to all of us as a society, and liberals have took it upon themselves to sort of be the critic of the government, the critic of the structure. You could view it as coming from, if we build a house, well, the conservatives, they're the structure. They provided some sort of foundation. Now, without liberals, the structure would eventually, blow away with the times. It would erode, it would crade, because liberals actually, I believe, maintain the structure. Now, without conservatives, on the other hand, you probably get a house that looks like something out of Dr. Seuss, something incredibly creative and out there, but would probably blow over. This is why I think we actually need each other. And it's not so much that liberals hold the high ground, it's that conservatives, their morals has kind of sunk down. So they've just kind of settled for less, sold out who they are, and just sort of kind of lost themselves and become more hypocritic. So it's not so much that we, or the liberal position, is saying we're above conservatives or we're more right than you. I think it's more along the lines of liberals honestly would like to see conservatives rise up so we can work together and have that mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that's what this debate is about. I mean, I don't like it that liberals currently hold the moral high ground, but I believe it's a fact because conservatism has sunken so low in today's day and age. And I think
Okay, so I think I understood what you were getting at. So let's go back and kind of address parts of your speech. You first talked about how conservatism inherently uphold things like greed and such. And I assume you're really talking about the way that conservatives look at things such as capitalism and limited government. However, when we look at studies, it's empirical fact that when you see lower marginal tax rates on everybody, the entire country and countries around the world will flourish. Economic benefit leads to higher quality of life, longer lives. We'll see reduce in poverty, empathetic to be capitalistic. The idea of capitalism assumes that there will be people who will be greedy and there'll be people who will be selfish. And so naturally to do that, they have to build a business. They have to hire other people. They have to do these things. Capitalism doesn't say that this is good. It says we should utilize this for the common good. I agree. I think an entire house built out of liberals would probably blow apart. And if an entire house built out of conservatives would fall apart. I'm saying we do need each other. But the problem is, if we're going to argue that one, we can't argue. If we both need each other, we sincerely cannot argue that one is better than the other, morally speaking, because they are both required for the existence of the nation. You say that one has championed some rights, yet conservatism and limited government has tried to protect us from terrible things like government overreach. We can see great conservatives like Rand Paul stand up to the Patriot Act, something that everybody was totally for, which allowed the government to spy on us. Obviously, both of them are needed. Both of them try and protect citizens. There are obvious outliers, but you can't say that one, if you're going to say that they both need each other, you can't say that one is morally better than the other. It's simply impossible to say that. That's the problem I have with your side of the resolution, is it's all subjective. It's your view of morality. You never showed why your view of morality is the view of morality that everyone should hold. Many different societies would disagree with you on what is moral. I don't really consider myself a conservative, but I understand that it's impossible for us to argue about which is morally better if inherently our argument comes down to what if we don't even know where morality comes from. The only way to say that one is morally better than the other is to have an objective form of morality. As I pointed out, which you have not responded to in the abortion example, both mindsets view themselves as morally superior. So how are you supposed to say which one is the better mindset? Everybody has a different opinion on what is really moral or immoral. You have not shown why your view of morality is somehow better than any other view of morality. I talked about how your view of morality sets up people to fail. It statistically hurts people. I presented that there's empirical fact that conservative capitalism leads to better quality of life. How is that less moral or more moral than liberalism?
To go over your examples, start off, I think you made a mistake of capitalism does not equal conservatism. You can have liberal capitalists, you can have capitalists. That's kind of a different trait altogether. So just to like jerry rig it in there doesn't seem very fair. With the Patriot Act, I would actually agree with that. The Patriot Act, for the most part, was immoral. So in that part, we agree. When it comes to the debate about abortion being the prime example between liberals and conservatives, my point on it being on the liberal side is the empathy of the abortion debate is misplaced on the fetus. It is totally undermining and not recognizing the woman's right over her own body, her own choice to do with her body, with it, what it needs to do. And I think that's what I was talking about earlier. It's sort of like an empathy misfire where conservatives think, oh, that's a fully formed, functioning baby inside of there and we need to protect it. Most of the times, first term pregnancies terminations are not. And even so, it seems that this is a moral issue brought up by conservatives because they have lost out on every single other moral issue. And this is the only one with some gray area, some notion that life begins at conception. So the basis of morality, and I used to be, anti-abortion too. And what changed my mind was the science. When I understood the actual procedure and what actually was happening, my moral view on it changed because I had the information. So I think education of is of the world around us and how we can determine these moral standards, because what we're proposing is not simple answers. If I had simple answers I could finish in 10 seconds, I would. But morality and philosophy is much more complicated than that. But with my other argument,
Okay, so I want to kind of address my opponent's points and then bring up two discouragements or reasons that I think everybody should disagree with the resolution. Let's first examine my opponent's points about he talks about liberal capitalist. The reason conservatives are capitalist is because of literally his definition of conservatism. Conservatism, as he talked about, is really looking to the past and looking and focusing on tradition and looking at what worked to really decide their actions. That's why we see a lot of progressive socialists, but I'm going to be honest, it's pretty hard to find a conservative socialist. So liberals who support capitalism, they support capitalism because capitalism has been proven to be an effective measure in the past. That's why conservatives support it. So yes, it goes hand in hand with conservativist ideal because that's inherently what conservatives do. Capitalism upholds the idea of limited government, promotes better systems. That's the conservative. Conservative is a view on capitalism of limited government. I'm going to get into that later. So my first objective morality. What my opponent did not respond to and really hasn't responded to since I talked about how his nature example falls through is that empathy in no way is a way to determine, is in no way linked to nature. His only example of empathy being linked to nature was of the shark and the bacteria feeding fish example, which is clearly not an example of empathy because the fish was doing that to survive, not because it felt bad for the shark. So the idea that empathy is based in nature, which he says is where morality comes from, is clearly false. There's no actual example of this. As I pointed out, morality inherently, we can look at it from different viewpoints. That's the whole basis when we talk about abortion. He says his moral viewpoint changed. That's the whole thing. Morality can change if we view it from just a view of what we've learned and what's from nature. So how in the world are we supposed to decide what is morally superior if morality is truly subjective? He did not respond to that point. He did not show you how nature actually upholds empathy. But even if it did uphold empathy, you can see in my second discouragement, which is that conservatism helps people. What he failed to respond to is when I constantly brought up how conservatism, through lowering taxes, through getting rid of a welfare state, actually helps more people. And when you support liberal ideas like the welfare state, it sets up people to fail. These are basic economic principles. These are proven studies that show these ideas. When my opponent, even if we were to consider the view of empathy as truly what we're talking about, conservatism has done more to help people in need than liberalism has, because conservatism realizes the long-term prospects. It is because my opponent clearly cannot show you that one is inherently bigger than the other. He said himself, they both need each other. We both have different views. There's no way to determine what is better. Thank you.